The glass hit the floor before I understood what had happened. 1 second, I was standing at the edge of the kitchen island, holding a dish towel, watching my sister unwrap the birthday cake she'd brought. The next second, there was a sharp crack, not the kind of sound glass makes when it slips, but the kind it makes when someone throws it. And I was on the ground, my cheek pressed against the tile, a high-pitched ringing splitting through my skull. She was laughing. That's the part that stays with me. Not the pain, not the blood I didn't know was there yet. Not even the fact that my husband was standing 10 feet away and didn't move. It was the sound of her laughing. This bright, sharp, delighted sound, the kind you make when something is genuinely funny to you, while I tried to figure out which direction was up. "Oh my God, you should see your face," she said. I remember the ceiling. I remember thinking it was a strange angle to be looking at our kitchen from. I remember my husband saying her name, just her name, once, in a tone I'd heard him use before, the tone that means let's not make this a big deal, and I remember thinking, I am on the floor, and my head is ringing, and I don't know why, and the two people in this room are laughing and saying my name in the voice they use when they want me to calm down. I didn't go to the hospital that night. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I told myself I'd hit my head on the corner of the island when I fell. That was all, that the room was only spinning a little, that I'd feel better in the morning. My sister stayed for another hour and a half. She ate cake. She helped herself to a second's slice. She told my husband the story twice. The part where she'd thrown her hands up dramatically to demonstrate something, and the wine glass had just flown out of her grip. Wasn't that hilarious? Wasn't that just the most ridiculous thing? And both times she told it, she glanced at me to see if I was going to laugh too. I didn't laugh, but I also didn't say anything, because I never did. Because saying something meant a conversation I didn't have the energy for, and that conversation would lead to another one, and another, and at the end of all of them, I would be the one who was too sensitive, who couldn't take a joke, who always had to make everything into something. That was the role I'd been playing for 29 years. I knew every line. She left around 9. I took 3 ibuprofen and went to bed. At 2 in the morning, I woke up and vomited. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after that, back against the cool porcelain of the tub, the overhead light too bright, every sound in the house weirdly amplified. The refrigerator hum, a car passing outside, my husband's breathing from the bedroom. My head was a different kind of pain now. Not the sharp immediate pain from the fall, something deeper, something that felt like pressure behind my eyes and at the base of my skull simultaneously, like my brain was trying to push its way out in 2 directions at once. I thought about waking my husband. I didn't. I went back to bed. I told myself it was just from crying. I hadn't realized I'd been crying until then, and from the ibuprofen on an empty stomach, and from everything. Just from everything. By morning, the nausea was gone, but the headache wasn't. My husband asked how I was feeling, and I said fine, and we had coffee and didn't talk about the night before. That wasn't unusual. We had a whole architecture built around the things we didn't talk about, and the biggest wing of that structure was my sister. She was his favorite person. That sounds like an exaggeration. It isn't. She was funny. Genuinely, actually funny, in the way that people who've never had to be careful about anything tend to be funny, which is freely and without consequence. She was charming. She remembered details about people. She sent birthday texts with the right gifts and showed up to things with wine and knew exactly how to make a room feel like a party. My husband thought she was the best thing about my family. He told me that once, directly, and I had nodded and said, yeah, she really is. Because what else do you say to that about your own sister? The headache lasted through Tuesday. Wednesday, I was at my desk at work when something happened that I don't have a clean way to describe. The screen in front of me sort of shifted, not physically, not in a way anyone else would have seen, and then my left hand went numb, pins and needles from my wrist to my fingertips, and then it was fine. 10 seconds, maybe. Then completely fine. I called my doctor's office from the parking lot. The earliest they had was Friday, so I said, okay, Friday, and drove home. That night I Googled things I shouldn't have Googled and closed the tabs and told myself it was tension. I told myself I was a person who got tension headaches, and this was one of those, just a long one. I took a bath. I went to sleep. Thursday morning I woke up, and my vision was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the movie version where everything goes blurry and someone stumbles into a wall. Just slightly wrong, like the world had been printed on paper and someone had shifted it 0.5 millimeter to the right. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and waited for it to correct itself. It didn't. My husband left for work. I called my office and said I had a migraine, technically not a lie, and then I sat there for another 40 minutes, just sitting with it, trying to decide. Then I got my keys and drove myself to the ER. I want to be clear about something. I drove myself because I didn't want to call anyone. Not my husband, not my mother, not my friend, who would have dropped everything and not asked too many questions. I drove myself because going to the emergency room felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud, and I didn't want a witness to that admission. I wanted to be able to leave if it turned out to be nothing. I wanted to be able to decide, alone, how big a deal this was. The intake nurse asked me what brought me in. I said I'd hit my head a few days ago and had some ongoing symptoms. She asked how I'd hit my head. I said I fell. That was technically true. I did fall. What I didn't say was that I fell because a wine glass had struck me in the temple, which I'd worked out by then, the math of it, the angle and the location of the impact, or that the person who threw it was my sister, or that she had stayed and eaten cake afterward. I didn't say those things because I still wasn't sure. I was still, at that point, leaving room for the possibility that it had been an accident. The ER doctor was a woman in her early 40s with the particular brand of calm that people develop when they spend their days in situations where panic would be genuinely dangerous. She introduced herself, asked me the standard questions, and then asked me to follow her finger with my eyes. She asked me to squeeze her hands. She asked me to touch my nose, and then her finger, and then my nose again. She shone a light in each eye and looked at the way my pupils responded, and something in her expression shifted. Very slightly, the way things shift when a professional sees something they recognize. She ordered a CT scan. She didn't explain why exactly. She said it was standard given my symptoms and the mechanism of injury, and I nodded like I knew what that meant. And a technician came and wheeled me back to a room that smelled like cold plastic and industrial cleaner, and I lay there in the machine listening to it, knock and clunk and whir, and I stared at the ceiling and thought, this is probably nothing. This is probably fine. I'm going to feel embarrassed about this later. She came back about 40 minutes after they'd taken me back to my curtained space. She had a tablet in her hands. She turned it toward me. I'm not a radiologist. I can't read a CT scan, but I have eyes. And what she showed me was 2 images side by side, and even without medical training, even without knowing what I was supposed to be seeing, I could see that they were different. That one of them had something the other didn't. When did you say this happened? She asked. Tuesday, I said, 5 days ago. She set the tablet down on the little rolling table beside the bed. She didn't sit down. She looked at me for a moment in a way that was careful and direct at the same time. The injury we're seeing is consistent with direct impact, she said. There's a small subdural bleed. That's bleeding between the brain and the skull. That's been there for several days, which tracks with your timeline. The good news is it appears to be slow and stable, meaning it hasn't expanded significantly. That's why you were able to function. But it does explain your symptoms. She paused. You said you fell? I said yes. She said, can you tell me more about how that happened? And I don't know why that question, specifically, after all the other questions, broke something open. Maybe it was the way she asked it. Not accusatory, not clinical, just genuinely wanting to understand. Maybe it was that I hadn't slept properly in 5 days. Maybe it was that I was lying in a hospital bed looking at an image of the inside of my own skull, and it was harder, from that position, to maintain the story I'd been telling myself. I told her the truth. I told her about the wine glass. I told her about the angle, about where I was standing, about the sound. I told her my sister had been demonstrating something, and the glass had, I stopped. I started again. I told her that I wasn't sure it had been an accident. The doctor didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Has something like this happened before?" That was the question that made me understand I was in a different kind of conversation than I'd thought. Because the answer was yes. Not like this. Nothing that had put me in a hospital before. But I sat there in that bed and I started thinking. Really thinking, without the filter I usually applied, and what I came up with was the time the car door swung shut on my fingers in the parking lot of a restaurant, and my sister had been right there, and it had happened so fast, and everyone had said these things happen. The time I'd slipped on her front steps in December and she'd laughed and said she kept meaning to salt those. Oops. The time a picture frame had fallen off the wall and hit my shoulder at her apartment, and she'd said the hook was old. She'd been meaning to replace it. Things that happen to people, things that had been happening to me, specifically in my sister's specific vicinity, for as long as I could remember. The doctor stepped out. She came back a few minutes later and said she'd made a call, and I understood from the way she said it that she hadn't called a nurse. A little while after that, 2 people came through the curtain. A man in plain clothes with a badge on his belt, and a woman in a hospital security jacket. And the man introduced himself as a detective, and he pulled a chair up to the side of my bed. And he asked me if I'd be willing to answer some questions. I said yes. I don't remember deciding to say yes, I just did. He asked me to start from the beginning. Not just Tuesday, from the beginning. And I did. I told him about the picture frame and the car door and the front steps and a dozen other things that I had never put in sequence before, that I had never allowed to be a sequence, because a sequence implied something I wasn't ready to accept. He listened. He took notes on a small pad. He didn't tell me what to think about any of it. At one point he asked, "Does your husband know about these incidents?" I said, "He was there for some of them." He wrote something down. My husband arrived about an hour after that. I hadn't called him. The hospital had, because he was listed as my emergency contact, and I had a moment of pure dread when I saw him come through the curtain, because I knew, the instant I saw his face, that he had already talked to someone in the hallway. His expression was the one I knew, the careful one, the one that means, let's think about this before we say anything we can't take back. He looked at the detective. He looked at me. He said, "Sweetheart, what's going on?" I told him what was going on. I told him about the CT scan. I told him what I'd told the detective. I watched his face while I talked, the way you watch someone's face when you're saying something you've needed to say for a long time and you're not sure how it's going to land. He said, "She didn't throw it at you. That's insane. You know that's insane." I said, "I know what it felt like." He said her name. Just her name, the same way he'd said it on Tuesday night, the tone that means let's not make this a big deal. I said, "She's done things like this before." He said, "Things like what? Things happen. You can't just." He stopped. He looked at the detective, then back at me. He lowered his voice. "You cannot accuse her of something like this based on an accident." And I understood in that moment something that I had been not understanding for years. Not because my husband was a bad person. I don't think he is, or wasn't, or I don't know, but because I could see it so clearly from where I was sitting, with a small bleed in my skull and a detective in a chair at the foot of my bed. I could see that he loved her version of her more than he'd ever tried to love my version of her. He had always made room for her explanations. He had never, not once, made room for mine. The detective asked my husband to wait outside. He didn't want to. He waited outside. What happened next took several weeks, and I'm going to try to compress it without losing the parts that matter. The detective followed up. He pulled records. There was a camera at the restaurant where the car door had happened. The parking lot was covered, and there was footage. I never watched it. He told me what was on it, and I believed him without needing to see it. My sister's previous address had a file, a neighbor complaint from 4 years ago, someone who lived below her at the time. I hadn't known that. There were things I hadn't known. My sister hired a lawyer immediately. The lawyer made arguments. The process was slow and bureaucratic, and nothing like television. and there were weeks where nothing seemed to be happening at all, and other weeks where things happened very fast in ways I didn't understand until later. I hired my own lawyer, which felt surreal. I had never hired a lawyer for anything in my life, and she was patient with me in the way that people are patient when they've had this exact conversation many times and have learned how much patience it requires. My husband and I separated during this time. That was his decision, initially, and then mine. He said he needed space to process. I said okay. I moved into a short-term rental and slept in a bed that wasn't mine, and called my mother twice a week and talked about everything except the thing we were both talking about. My mother was not a simple figure in this. She isn't. She never believed my sister was incapable of love or warmth, neither do I, but she also never believed my sister was capable of something deliberate. And I understand the architecture of that belief, even now. When you've raised someone and loved them and watched them become a person, the idea that they are hurting someone on purpose is a specific kind of unbearable. It requires you to restructure everything. Most people don't want to do that. But my mother came to the hearing. That was not something I expected. She sat in the third row, on the left side of the aisle, and she didn't look at my sister when she walked in, and she didn't look at me. She looked at her hands in her lap. My lawyer had warned me not to read too much into the presence of family members, that it meant different things in different contexts, that I should focus on what I could control. I tried to do that. My sister's lawyer presented the argument that each incident, viewed individually, was an accident. That's the thing about a pattern. It only becomes one when you look at all of it at once. When you isolate each piece, it looks like nothing. A glass slipping, ice on stairs, an old hook, things that happen. The prosecutor read the evidence aloud, the parking lot footage, the neighbor complaint, a text message exchange that the detective had obtained through the process. I didn't fully understand. Something my sister had sent to a mutual friend 2 days before my birthday that didn't explicitly say anything but, when placed in context with everything else, said everything. The ER records showing the age of the injury, the specificity of the impact site, the pattern. I watched my mother's face while the evidence was read. I saw the moment it happened. I don't know how to describe it except to say that something closed. Like a room whose door you've been watching for years finally swings shut. Not with a bang, but quietly, with a soft click, and you know it's not opening again. She didn't cry. Not in the courtroom. I found out later she cried in the car in the parking garage for 45 minutes before she could drive. She called me that night and said, "I'm sorry I made it harder." That was all. I said okay. We stayed on the phone for a long time not talking, just breathing, and that felt like the most honest conversation we'd had in years. My sister was convicted on 2 counts, not as many as I had hoped for, more than her lawyer had argued for. The sentencing was not what some people in the comments of the local news article thought it should have been. I saw those comments. My lawyer had advised me not to look. I looked anyway. And there were people who were angry on my behalf in ways I didn't have the energy to be, and people who said the system had failed, and maybe they were right. I'm not a prosecutor. I can't retry the case in my head and get a different outcome. What I can tell you is that she is on probation for 3 years, with conditions, that she is required to have no contact with me, that the restraining order exists in paper form in a folder in my filing cabinet, and I have looked at it and it is real, and it has my name on it, and it has her name on it, and the judge's signature is at the bottom. She has not tried to contact me. I don't know if that's the lawyer's advice or her own decision, or if there is a part of her, somewhere, that knows. My husband and I finalized our separation agreement in the spring. It was civil, as these things go. He said at one point, over coffee in the parking lot of our mediator's building, that he was sorry he hadn't taken it more seriously. I don't know what it means to him in that sentence. The incidents maybe. Or me. I said thank you, and meant it. I also meant the things I didn't say, which is that sorry, in this particular case, is a small word for a large thing, and I'm not sure what to do with it yet. I live alone now. I have a dog. I finally have a dog. I always wanted one, and my husband was allergic. And she is a brown and white mutt named after a road I drove on during the worst week of all of this, which felt like the right way to name something that came out of that time. She sleeps at the foot of my bed and has opinions about squirrels. She is the best part of most days. My mother and I talk twice a week. We are rebuilding something. I don't know what to call it yet, because what we're building is different from what was there before, and it doesn't have the old name. But it's real, and we're both working on it, and that's more than I had a year ago. I went to therapy. I'm still going. My therapist has never once told me what I should feel about any of this, which is the only approach that would have worked on me. I do the feeling. She helps me figure out what to do with what I find. Some days I'm fine. Some days I wake up at 2 in the morning with a particular quality of silence that reminds me of the night I sat on the bathroom floor and waited for everything to stop spinning. And it takes me a while to come back to where I actually am, which is a different apartment, a different city, a dog at the foot of the bed, a restraining order in a folder in a cabinet. I stayed quiet for a long time, about all of it. I stayed quiet because that was the role I knew. It was easier. It was what you did, in my family, with the things that were hard to say out loud. I'm not doing that anymore. Not because I'm angry. I am sometimes, but that's not why. Not because I want sympathy, though I have learned slowly to let it in when people offer it genuinely. I'm saying it because there was a version of me, 5 days after that birthday dinner, who drove herself to the emergency room alone and didn't tell anyone the full story because she wasn't sure what the story was. And that version of me had been living that way for a long time, making room for every explanation except the one that was true. The doctor who ordered the CT scan told me afterward, when everything was done, that she thinks about cases like mine sometimes. She said that when someone comes in and says they fell, she always asks how. Not because she assumes the worst, but because sometimes people don't know how to say the real thing until someone asks them the right question. She asked me the right question. I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't. I try not to think about that too carefully. But I do think about her sometimes, in the way you think about the moments that changed the direction of things. Not dramatic moments, not movie moments. Just a woman in her early 40s with a tablet in her hands, turning it toward me, asking, "When did you say this happened?" That was when things started to become true.